Welcome back to season 2 of Content That Grows podcast. We're excited to jump in this season. Today I'm sitting down with my co-founder, Kevin King. What's up, Kevin?
What's going on, Nate? Good to be back.
Yeah, excited to jump in. So this season, we're really looking at kind of like what are some of the key elements. You look at like SaaS companies that have great content programs. Like what are some of the key elements of how they've done that and grown over time and made it an important part of their business. And so today we are starting with, kind of understanding the importance of having a clear ICP, how you kind of get to understanding what that is, and as well as sort of the pain points and all that. So I think to frame up how we want to think about today, it's really, whether it's a content marketer or marketing lead or anything in a company, it's just imagining, head of marketing or CEO or someone says, hey, we really want to, be creating more content that's aligned to our ICP, addressing their pain points. And so today we just kind of jump into like, if someone's in that position, how do they actually go about that? What, why is it important? What are some of the elements there? So, I would say, to start off, like one of the things I guess is probably important is defining what ICP means for everyone. So ideal customer profile is what ICP means. And so as we're thinking about that, it's essentially saying, for your business, what is the, if you were to say like, this is my dream customer, like they're, they have all these markers or attributes or whatever about them. And that's kind of what we want to get into today. So that's essentially what your ideal customer profile is. And so, there's a number of ways that we can look about how to get that data from people. So let's just start there. As you think about wanting to understand a clear ICP for a business, kind of where do you start, or where does your mind kind of go first?
I mean, there's a couple different places. I think, it all depends on the stage of the company. And I think you typically, if you've been around for even just a little while, there's going to be a lot of existing collateral and data that you can tap into.
Yeah.
Leveraging other teams is going to be incredibly important. And I think historically, I've seen in the past, even a couple companies that I've been at, including Sprout and Review Trackers, is just customer success is a huge team to like really start with. I think they'd probably be arguably one of the best. I think a lot of people like to start with sales just because they're having the conversations like the most with people and identifying more
Yeah.
pain points and all that. But customer success, I mean, if you have already a high volume of clients that are using your product actively and have been around for a while, they're going to be a wealth of information and likely have already created things
Yeah.
that you can like leverage already to like bake into some sort of framework that you have for your ICP. So I think like I think again, typically you see people go to sales or even sales enablement, which I will also point to too. But I think customer success or customer support, combination of the two is definitely a great place to start for having sourcing data or qualitative data on who your ICP should actually be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's interesting because my mind goes to like from in that scenario. I think you're talking about a company that's a little bit further along. If you have sales enablement, customer success, you're probably a bit more established. Um, in that case, my mind goes to like, I just want to like pivot the data, a lot of the data around CRM because really, it's like, well, what are the common markers we can find around the customers that are actively engaged in the product, that their the retention is strong, like all those things that you can pluck out some insights there. But um, if we're to take a step back into like an earlier stage company where maybe there's good product market fit and there's a little bit of traction, but um, as a SaaS company, they really haven't like added a ton of those, or maybe even don't have a ton of data. That's where I think it gets a little more interesting. Is to say like, what is a clear ICP in that case, and how do they determine that? And for me, I think I kind of jump to like, especially in a smaller company, it's just easier to sort of like work across, chat with more people. So like the product team is probably going to be the ones that are the most progressive in this because they have been in whatever way just literally calling people up or any sort of research that they've done. Like they're just in the weeds trying to figure out how do we need to build this product to help you out. So to me, that's kind of where I would jump early on, is like really just with directly with product team, and then also just pretty typical that your CEO is at earlier stage is going to be deeply involved there. So probably less
Totally.
data backed, but you're maybe relying a little more on qualitative, but you should have some early signals there as well of how to build from that.
For sure. And there's also kind of like a chicken or the egg thing there too, which you like both kind of touched on. That it depends on the stage of the company, right? So like
Yeah.
starting with CS could be a thing that you could tap into for like one that's been more established, but early on product is. But ultimately too, I think CS comes back into it, and I'm definitely trying to like anchor to CS a little bit, but product team will continue to tap into CS further
Yeah.
down the line to actually keep iterating on product. And actually, I've seen them become, again, even a bigger source for other departments too, not just like marketing when it comes to that. So I totally agree. Product
Yeah.
is going to be a critical part of that. It's just like, it always depends on how kind of like systematize getting that data, that information and that data. So it's not like you're tapping into your team and your CS team or even your product team too much. Like that's going to be the
Right.
biggest challenge that you counter is like leveraging resources that need to be focused on like building the product. And that's what marketing always runs up against is
Yeah.
how do I get this information without taxing those resources from doing the job that they need to do?
Yeah. And I think, yeah, you also kind of, that's a good point. Like, if you are at that scale, more the scale point, like the systematized way of getting it not only saves the relationship of like constantly tapping into people, but also helps you avoid the bias of that one CS rep who just gets real bullish on certain things because of a few conversations they've had, and like really make sure you're kind of keeping that quantitative aspect. So I think that's great and an excellent point. Um, I think the other thing that's always kind of interesting to me is I feel like especially marketers can get a bit um, maybe like romantic about this idea of like our ICP and personas, and kind of like geek out on it's this many employees and they have this and this is whatever. And I think there's kind of a challenge of like moving from like factual into sort of hypothetical or making that assumption. And so um, I'm curious like how you would think about where you sort of draw that line of firmographic or demographic data, um, and we can get into in a minute like some of the pain points and what exactly that means, to kind of uncover. But like where do you draw the line of like being helpful and then getting into like sort of creative storytelling about what this person might be needing or wanting to do?
I think I've thought about this a lot because I think this has become a more of a not hot topic or controversial topic, but I think we as marketers used to anchor ourselves to building like personas in a very very traditional way, I guess. Like to your point, using demographic data and all that. So like I don't know if that's really necessary. Rand Fishkin and has a great post about that, a couple on SparkToro, which obviously we're all big fans of here, where he talks about how that kind of approach is kind of outdated, right? And some of the more psychographic stuff is even better to use, which I totally agree with. But
Yeah.
I do think that like depending again on the stage of the company, stuff like job title and all of that, like if you have enough data to understand who your main points of contact are from that perspective, are going to give you a good sense of like really understanding who you should be targeting and who you should be talking to. um, Again, product depends, all that stuff, but I don't know if you need to be going into any of the other stuff from like a demographic. A good story or anecdote was back at Sprout. I built a massive persona spreadsheet for Bamboo, which was like 5 different personas across different various uh, of SMB, mid market, enterprise. I went so far as to I scraped all of our raw data. I got normalized, quantified the number of job titles. I even found the picture of people that were actual leads and then just made them different people so I could like really paint the picture of like this is who that person is. I'm sure you've seen it. HubSpot has templates for these types of things, and that's not
Yeah.
to knock on that, but like it got a lot of it got great reception internally. People were like, "This is really great. It's really helpful." But I don't think we really ever like put it into action in any way because I don't know really how you do it. It's
Yeah.
great to understand, but I think those things are less actionable. So I think the line I think is kind of hard is a lot more clear this day. On like there's a few key points that you should be pulling out, but you should really be just like focusing on some of the pain points and stuff that you were like probably alluding to and things that, and then just like confirming or validating it based on a job title
Yeah.
or things like that.
Yeah. 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 I agree. I feel like the personification of it, and like this is, our persona, Mellow Mike. He's, 34 and whatever, and this is whatever. Like, it's, I think the spirit of it is good. It's like, a lot of people say like it's not B2B marketing, it's human to human marketing. And like, I think it's good at helping you remember that it's ultimately a person on the other end. But I agree that I think most of the time those collect dust and don't really have a good way to translate. So yeah, I think it's what you said makes sense. And then from there, it's like getting into some of the stuff we want to talk about with like the pain points. So obviously that's another area where people talk about create content that addresses their pain points. So like, what does that mean? Let's dig in a little bit there and talk through all the different ways that might come up. So I think one of the ways, if your company has done this, would actually be maybe not considered a pain point, but the jobs to be done framework is certainly one way that you're sort of surfacing like, no, they didn't just sign up because they wanted to sign up for this product. They signed up because they need to do X and your product can help them do it. And so, understanding what those jobs are that they're trying to do with your product and what they're trying to accomplish can kind of help you frame that out. But, what do you jump to when you think about pain points?
Well, yeah, I definitely think that the jobs to be done framework and conceptually is the way to really think about it, because there's a lot of ways to look at that, and there's a lot of different like modifications of that framework. But generally, being like, what are the outcomes that people are trying to get to or drive to, right? Versus I'm just trying to do this thing, and these are the pain points or the blockers or anything in the way. Um, so I think if you start to think about it from that perspective, like I was thinking about this earlier, but like if you use a product, um, like, a marketing automation platform where you need to, send emails out, right? That's, your job that the person is doing is sending emails out. And a lot of people would be like, well, it's to send emails out. But it's like, if you start to go and actually append that kind of statement with like, so I can insert
Yeah.
this here, you can start to like understand or creatively think about the things that they're truly trying to accomplish, um, and start to really build an understanding of like the actual pain points or things that they're trying to actually address to drive whatever business outcome I guess they're trying to get to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So to round out that example, it's not so I can send email I want to send email. It's I want to send email so I can educate my existing customers on new product
Correct.
features so I can, whatever, help add value, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah,
Yeah.
totally makes sense. I think that's a helpful distinction in a way to kind of move further into that. And I think, outside of that, it's also like, um, yeah, I think maybe even just the framing of pain points sometimes is misleading because like I would say a lot of the time it's sort of like, um, maybe like a motivator or something would be a better word, but like it's not necessarily pain point just sounds like this is a negative thing, it's a problem, whereas like a lot of it could be proactive. How do I whatever scale my paid media team, or how do I build a social media strategy, or how do I integrate Slack with whatever, like things that are sort of like they're building, it's proactive, it's moving forward, it's doing that. And there's a lot of like research terms that kind of come around that, but it's not necessarily pain. It's just sort of that the educational, informational type of query. I think is a big one, but it does come from understanding who is your audience, who is that ICP, and within that, what are they trying to do in their role, typically, to be able to know, well, here's some common things that come up for that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's ultimately the interesting part about like what you're building content wise for various stages of the funnel as we talk about it is, you know, educating on how you solve things that are almost like peripheral to the job to be done, right? Because that's how you're going to like actually make them, the person who's using your product, ultimately even more powerful and more successful at their job. So in a lot of ways you're creating content that actually sometimes, I know we talk about like product led SEO and, you know, really focusing on the product, but like it's really important to make to complement that with content that, yes, you can tie to the product, but ultimately ties to their job. And
Yeah.
then you kind of start to, I think, ultimately gain more traction and interest in whatever you're doing. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think um, there's a number of factors there that just kind of all play together. So as we kind of go back for a second and think about understanding the ICP, how you might get that information internally, within the teams and that kind of stuff, and then from there, how do you take that and start to think through pain points? It is understanding that person's role, and there's a number of ways as a marketer to do that. It's one, just sit down and just think about, like, you should know enough about it, in whether it's like this person's a marketing manager for an e-commerce company, or they're a shipping manager for this whatever logistics company or something. Like, there's some things I think you can kind of come up with, like, just thinking through it. I think you can reach out and talk to customers. You just pick 10, reach out and ask them to chat for a few minutes and just ask them a few direct questions. I think there's, if your company has Gong or some sort of tool set up for like conversation intelligence, I think they call it. Being able to listen to those calls can be super insightful, and hearing how people talk about it. Reading support inquiries to your team, hearing how people talk about stuff there. Looking at any sort of like Reddit forums, Quora questions, any of that kind of stuff. You can find it information. I think so yeah, I mean, that's just the start. Obviously, tools like SparkToro, and probably still a dozen more ways you could do that. I don't know if you have any you want to add, but ultimately it's like, well, don't let some of these things stand in your way. Don't make them up. Don't 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 just sort of create fiction that these are the problems or pain points that they have, or motivators or whatever.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, don't make it this big complex thing. Just figure out a couple sources, dig in, and start understanding from there, and learn more about your ICP.
Yeah. To add to that too about like not even overthinking, I think like this might be slightly hot take ish, but ultimately
Yay.
where we are, where we're at with SaaS in general is there is a lot of concentration within specific areas, right? It's marketing. There's a lot of marketing tools. There's a lot of sales tools, and like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so we're at a point where a lot of the pain points are we know. So like if you're on a
Sure.
marketing team, you can go with a little bit of like instinctual understanding of what they should be solving for, unless you are, which we're starting to work with some really kind of like interesting and disruptive like technology companies that are doing
Yeah.
things for industries that haven't really been there yet. That's a whole different world, right? Like if you're working those, then
Yeah.
like all the things we're talking about, you've got to like do your work. But like if you're focused in areas that are generally like the things that SaaS even started out in, again, marketing, sales, CS, the big three probably, right?
Yeah.
They're all typically likely trying to solve for similar problems across all of those, based on just like how long the technology, SaaS products have been around in that space. So I
Yeah.
don't think you do need to spend a ton of time. It's more like just validating, I think, a lot of what you might know. So like, don't make them up,
Yeah.
but do a lot of validation on what you think could, should be talked about and addressed from like a pain point perspective.
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, I think the Martech, whatever it is now, it's the Martech
10
2000 and
million.
5000. Yeah, it just keeps growing. But so yes, from that perspective, there's a substantial number of people in the SaaS industry. Sorry, a substantial number of marketers in the SaaS industry that are marketing to marketers. In which case, you know it, or you like talk to your peer who is managing that area of marketing that is your customer and whatever. So there's some shortcuts for Sprout, certainly. Like by and large, social media managers, director of social media strategy, those types of things. And we had a number of social folks on our team that you could talk through and bounce ideas and whatnot. So I think that's a great point, that there are a lot that you can already have a pretty good idea of a starting point. So yeah, I think from there, it's like, how do you prioritize? And next episode we're getting into identifying topics and understanding search intent. So we won't get too far into that right now, but like, obviously it now becomes like, we're talking about ICP, we're talking about pain points and whatnot, but it is still under the premise of creating content for them. So I think that's worth digging in a little bit to kind of bridge that gap of like, okay, these things, and even outside of identifying the topics in detail, how do you start to shift your focus into content when you're thinking about ICP and pain points? Like, what are some of the things that come to mind first for you?
I mean, I think I don't mean to be like a broken record about CS or tapping into these other teams, but I mean, if you're especially if you're in house, right? If you're working with an agency, it's a little bit different, and the agency should be asking these questions or asking for these resources. But there
Yeah.
should already be, at some point, even if it's early on, or the product team, right? If it's early on and CS isn't fully like baked or anything, there should be a very good documentation of things that, for like reasons why this product exists, right? So there's usually a natural starting point internally, um, where people are asking questions or jotting down the questions that are being asked about, what they're trying to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. And those things, I think, are really, really ripe for those like long tail topics that aren't
Yeah.
necessarily going to be something that you're going to find in Ahrefs or whatever, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think if you're really going to be ICP and product focused, and we obviously educate and talk about this a lot about like third party tools and getting volume, but like, there is something to the instinctual nature of just like create content based off of the things that you've already learned from your customers or the people you've been talking about, and then go from there.
Yeah.
I think after a certain amount of time, if you've used that kind of general like direction or motion or strategy as a way to get content out there and indexed in search and collected data on it, you can start to iterate and optimize on what other things you should be talking about, because you start to understand like intent and all those things, especially from a search perspective. So I think, at
Yeah.
least to start, that's a great way to get that stuff. And I guess like, if you don't have any of that, I think it's an opportunity for marketing teams or agencies to enable their product or CS team with some form of questionnaire or something. I'm not like saying surveys, but some sort of, let's just say, thing to collect and synthesize that from the people who
Yeah.
are really closest to it, because marketing is always going to be a little bit further away.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's a great point that like, ultimately, if your company has gone so far as to build a product, you know, even just three basic workflow or things that someone's trying to do with your product, maybe more. And so, yes, I think we typically see that working well to start at product. And so you mentioned earlier, like product led content, which is essentially you need to do a thing. Here's how you can do it. Here's how a product can help you do that or do it more efficiently or, however that like benefit kind of ties in. But I think that's a great point. Like you should know some of that. You start there, you build some of that more product led content that has some of those tie ins. And then from there, you're able to kind of start to expand out and say, okay, well, that was sort of the a little more detailed explanation of how to do it and how to do it with our product. Let's go a level up and understand before someone gets to that point of wanting to know how to do that what's going on. Okay, well they're researching this, they're trying to understand this, they're so on and so forth. And I think that's where you start to say, okay, well I can identify 3 or 4 things I want to write about around this product led piece of content that I created, and then 5 or 6 around this one, and go from there. And then obviously as you continue to create more, you can kind of build outside of that and really start to leverage what we'll talk about in the next episode with identifying topics and understanding search intent and everything. So but yeah, I think that's a great point. Like start with what you know, and really just kind of focus on some of the very product focused aspects of it, and then build out from there.
Yeah, and I think also it's good because the build out from there thing can get really scalable and creative if you start to think about how your product fits into an organization, because this whole jobs to be done idea of like outcomes and all that, like rarely is a product singularly only impacting one team, right? So like you can
Right.
start to map out like almost a jobs to be done and outcome framework for the rest of the org once you've kind of like really built the foundation around your core ICP. Because at the end of the day, they work with people that might be leveraging this tool, or it might be impacting in some ways. Like you can talk about marketing automation or your CRM or whatever,
Yeah.
social, even social platforms or anything like that. So you can get into like a really interesting area, which we could talk about it again on the future episode. But just how you can start to like build out from your core ICP to like almost adjacent internal ICPs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we talked about Martech, and thinking back on some of the stuff with Sprout, like there was certainly a good amount of content that was more product focused, or this is how you do this and how you can do it with our product. We did plenty of that. But the amount of content we had around like strategic things, how to build an Instagram strategy, like so many things like that that were typically going to be prior to even like needing to do this, that in a platform, like building content calendars, like getting buy-in across the organization, whatever those topics are. I think totally relevant and a great point to add as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that's as I kind of think through everything we've talked about, it's from an ICP standpoint, you want to leverage if you're early stage, leverage the folks in your organization that are focused on product and really kind of like been in some of those research and conversations early. If you're a more established company, ICP, you can learn a lot from CS, from sales, and draw from a lot of that. And obviously being more systematized in how you're collecting data at scale there. And then from a pain point standpoint, you have jobs to be done framework and really understanding I want to do X so that and kind of complete that sentence so that you're really understanding the true intention behind the action, as well as, thinking through other use cases, looking at other sources for pain point or motivation type of topics that would really tie into the customer. And then from there, as you kind of bridge into content, it's starting with product led, very very focused around the things they want to do, and then expanding out into a number of topics that are sort of leading into those use cases where they would be doing the product. So anything else to add there on sort of our quick recap of the episode?
No, I think those a lot to take away. There's a lot of takeaways there. But I guess I just reinforce, because I think we've seen it more successfully nowadays than even a few years ago, that like it's so important to focus on that ICP and specifically jobs be done. I mean, I know that that's like a proprietary framework that's been iterated on, but like it's really critical step in the process of like coming up with a strategy and content, like topic ideation and all that. And I
Yeah.
really think if you anchor yourself to something like that, you're going to end up with a lot stronger content that is a lot more meaningful and effective for your audience than just going after, let's come up with a list of broad topics that generally touch on the space, right? Which is like the old school way of going up funnel and mid funnel and all
Yes.
that. So
So,
it's the way to go.
yes, I was just debating whether or not I wanted to also just throw in what happens when you create content that isn't focused on your ICP and their pain points. And I was debating, but you mentioned it, so let's go there. Uh, um, we still see today company, like we were just talking about a company the other day creating 150 posts per month, uh, and looking through the topics and seeing this is in no way tied to the product, to the ICP. It is content for the sake of content to generate traffic for the sake of traffic. And it's just like mind-boggling to me that we still see it as much as we do in 2022. Like there's yeah, like number, actually I'm thinking more, there's a number that we've come across in different industries recently that the volume is very high and the topics are thin, or maybe barely related to the company, but really not. And it's just we've sort of seen that like that can grow traffic really really quickly, but it doesn't sustain. You run into authority issues. You run into the fact that eventually someone comes up and says, why are we spending so much money to create all this content? What is it doing for us other than traffic? In which case there can't possibly be a good answer because it's so irrelevant. So yeah, so that to me is like, you can do it. You can get great results. You can create content that's not anywhere remotely related to your ICP, anything. You can probably get traffic, but in the long run, it is absolutely not the way to go.
Yeah, those metrics, those or that type of growth looks really great on paper. Executive team, board, that's what that usually is being driven by, or just some sort of misguided uh, strategy on just like we want to grow fast without really thinking through the consequences of like the lack of intention and thoughtfulness about content. So that's the thing I'd say to wrap that up, is just like, be thoughtful, be intentional about the content. It's not ever going to be about like a massive amount of volume. Yeah, if you're trying to catch up to a competitor, just think about what that really means. To your point, like
Yeah.
we've come across it more and more, seeing websites publishing. I saw a website that published, they had a timestamp and a date stamp with like 46 posts on one day, because they're just trying to feed the search engine index. And that's just,
Yeah.
who's that for? Who's that really, like at the end of the day, who are you trying to reach? I mean, you're going
Yeah.
to get some organic metrics, but I don't know. And then if you think about what goes into that stuff, there's just a much more meaningful outcome if you're being thoughtful about like the level of content you're producing and volume and all of that and what it is.
Yep. Yeah. Totally agree. All right. Well, I think we got that out of our system, so we'll call that good. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and as we chat through, like you said, ICP pain points, creating content around that, and what that means, and kind of how you can work through some of those steps within your company. Please visit 10speed.io/podcast, where you can get the show notes, play back anything else around this, a little more information there. And please be sure to subscribe and rate the podcast for us, and stay tuned for the next episode, as we'll be diving into identifying topics for your content and understanding search intent. So as you're building all that out, you can have some good process around how to do it and why certain aspects of that matter to your business. So thanks very much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Yep. Thanks, Nate.